Natural gas in the United States costs $3 per million BTU. In Europe, $30, 10 times more expensive. This isn't a temporary spike. This is the permanent energy crisis that's deindustrializing Europe while America and Asia surge ahead. Right now, European manufacturers are paying energy costs that make production uneconomical. BASF, the world's largest chemical company, uses as much energy as the entire country of Denmark. When their energy costs tripled after losing Russian pipeline gas, the choice was simple: close European plants. Move production to the United States and China where energy is cheap. The International Energy Agency published data in December 2024 showing European industrial electricity prices at €250 per megawatt hour. US prices are €70. China prices are €60. This isn't just expensive. This is economically catastrophic. This price differential became permanent precisely when Europe cut off Russian pipeline gas in 2022 and pivoted to expensive liquefied natural gas imports. The probability of Europe maintaining industrial competitiveness while paying 10 times more for energy than competitors is zero. This is the pattern of every deindustrialization in history. Britain in the 1970s lost competitiveness, and manufacturing fled to cheaper locations. The US Rust Belt in the 1980s lost steel and auto manufacturing to Japan and Korea with lower costs. Now Europe is experiencing the same exodus, but this time it's self-inflicted through energy policy choices. Fatih Birol, executive director of the International Energy Agency, stated in November 2024, "Europe's energy crisis is not temporary. The infrastructure decisions made in 2022 and 2023, the LNG terminals, the long-term import contracts, these lock in high prices for decades. European industry is relocating not because of a short-term shock, but because the cost structure is permanently uncompetitive." Even more alarming, European governments have no solution. They can't rebuild the Russian pipeline infrastructure that was destroyed. They can't force LNG exporters to charge less. They can't subsidize energy indefinitely without bankrupting their treasuries. Europe is trapped in a high energy cost structure with no exit. The assumption that Europe could replace cheap Russian pipeline gas with LNG imports without permanently damaging industrial competitiveness broke completely when the math of physics and economics proved otherwise. Here's what should terrify every European worker and investor. Energy-intensive industries represent 30% of European industrial employment. Chemicals, steel, aluminum, cement, glass, paper, all require massive energy inputs. When energy costs triple and stay high, these industries don't adapt. They leave, and those jobs don't come back. Think about that. Before we break down exactly how Europe went from energy security with Russian gas to permanent crisis with LNG, why the physics and economics of LNG make it inherently more expensive than pipelines, which industries are leaving and where they're going, and why this crisis is unfixable without policy changes Europe won't make. If you want to understand the most important economic story in Europe, that's destroying competitiveness and jobs, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what we're revealing will change how you see European manufacturing, and why the continent that led the Industrial Revolution is deindustrializing in real time. Leave a comment. Can Europe survive with energy costs 10 times higher than competitors? Should Europe have kept Russian gas despite Ukraine? And which country benefits most from European industrial exodus? Let's start with the numbers because they reveal the scale of the price differential and why it's devastating. Natural gas in the United States, measured at Henry Hub benchmark, averaged $3.20 per million BTU in 2024. That's relatively stable. US has abundant shale gas. Domestic production meets domestic demand. Prices are set by supply and demand within North America. Natural gas in Europe, measured at TTF benchmark in the Netherlands, averaged $31 per million BTU in 2024. That's down from peaks of $80 during the acute crisis in 2022, but it's still 10 times US prices. Why? Because Europe lost 55 billion cubic meters of annual pipeline gas from Russia. That's 40% of European gas consumption. And they replaced it with LNG imports that are structurally more expensive. Pipeline gas is cheap. You build the pipeline once. Then gas flows continuously at low marginal cost. The major cost is the upfront capital to build the pipeline. Once built, the operating cost is minimal. That's why Russian pipeline gas was so cheap. The pipelines were already built and paid for decades ago. LNG is expensive. You need to build liquefaction plants to cool gas to minus 160 degrees Celsius. Then you ship it in specialized LNG tankers across oceans. Then you need regasification terminals to turn it back into gas. Each step requires massive capital investment and ongoing operational costs. The result is LNG is structurally 3 to 5 times more expensive than pipeline gas, even when both are available. And in a tight global LNG market where demand exceeds supply, prices go higher. Europe is now dependent on LNG for 60% of gas needs. Before 2022, it was 20%. This shift is permanent. The Nord Stream pipelines that carried Russian gas to Germany were sabotaged in September 2022. They're destroyed, not coming back. Even if geopolitical relations with Russia improved, which they won't for decades, the physical infrastructure to deliver cheap pipeline gas doesn't exist anymore. Europe built 12 new LNG import terminals since 2022. Germany alone built 4. These terminals represent 50 billion euros in investment. That's sunk cost. They're not going to abandon this infrastructure. So Europe is locked into LNG dependence for the next 30 years minimum. And LNG prices are set by global markets. When Asia bids up prices because China or Japan need gas, European prices rise too. Europe is now competing with Asia for the same LNG cargoes. And Asia can often pay more. This is the energy trap. Europe is stuck in a high-cost energy structure with no way out. Now let's talk about the impact on industry, because this isn't abstract. Real companies are making real decisions to leave Europe. Start with chemicals. BASF announced in 2023 they're permanently downsizing European operations and expanding in China and Louisiana. Their Ludwigshafen site in Germany, the largest chemical complex in the world, is being reduced. Some production lines shut down permanently. Others moved overseas. Why Louisiana? Natural gas costs $3. BASF can produce chemicals at a fraction of European cost. Why China? Energy is subsidized by the government and costs 60 euros per megawatt hour for industrial users. BASF is not alone. Covestro, another major German chemical company, is reducing European capacity. LyondellBasell is shifting production to the US. INEOS is expanding in the US and Middle East while cutting European operations. The European Chemical Industry Council estimates that 20% of chemical production capacity has left or will leave Europe by 2027. That's permanent deindustrialization. Steel is facing the same crisis. ArcelorMittal, the world's largest steel company, is cutting European production. Their German and French plants are operating at reduced capacity or being closed. Steel production is extremely energy intensive. When electricity costs 250 euros per megawatt hour, you can't compete with US steel at 70 euros or Chinese steel at 60 euros. ThyssenKrupp, Germany's iconic steel company, is on the verge of bankruptcy. They're trying to find a buyer. Most likely outcome is Chinese acquisition at fire sale prices or complete shutdown. Aluminum smelting has almost completely left Europe. Aluminum requires enormous amounts of electricity. Smelters need stable, cheap power. Europe can't provide that anymore. Production moved to the Middle East, where energy is subsidized, or to Norway and Iceland, where hydropower is abundant and cheap. Alcoa shut down Spanish smelters. Trimet closed German facilities. Norsk Hydro, although Norwegian, is expanding in Brazil and the Middle East, not Europe. Cement, glass, and paper industries are all energy intensive and all facing the same crisis. Reduce European production or go bankrupt. The rational choice is to leave. Even less energy-intensive industries are affected. Automotive manufacturing uses a lot of electricity. Volkswagen's decision to close German factories isn't just about Chinese EV competition. It's also about energy costs making German production uneconomical. The cumulative impact is massive. European industrial production is down 12% from 2018 levels. Manufacturing employment is falling. The trade balance is deteriorating because Europe is importing more manufactured goods as domestic production shrinks. Germany, the industrial powerhouse of Europe, is in its third recession in 4 years. France's industrial output is stagnant. Italy is slightly better, but only because they never had as much heavy industry. Now let's talk about why European governments can't fix this, because the constraints are political and physical, not just economic. First, political constraint on Russian gas. The political consensus in Europe is that buying Russian gas is funding Putin's war in Ukraine. Therefore, Russian gas is morally unacceptable, regardless of the economic cost. This is a values-based decision, not an economic one. And in democracies, values sometimes override economics. So even though returning to Russian gas would solve the energy crisis, it's not politically possible. Some countries quietly buy Russian LNG. France and Spain import Russian LNG because technically, it's different from pipeline gas. But pipeline gas from Russia is politically toxic. No European leader can advocate for it without being accused of supporting Putin. Second, physical constraint on pipelines. Even if politics changed, the pipelines are destroyed. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 were sabotaged. Repair would take years and billions. And who would guarantee security? The pipelines run through the Baltic Sea. Any country with naval capability could sabotage them again. Alternative pipelines through Turkey or Southern Europe face different problems. Turkey wants to be the gatekeeper and extract rent. Southern pipeline routes are longer, more expensive, and face construction delays. So physically, cheap Russian pipeline gas is not returning to Europe this decade, regardless of politics. Third, LNG supply is constrained globally. Europe is competing with Asia for LNG. Global liquefaction capacity is approximately 450 million tons per year. Demand is 500 million tons. There's a supply deficit. New liquefaction plants are being built in the US, Qatar, and Australia. But these take 5 to 7 years to complete. So global LNG supply won't significantly increase until the late 2020s. And when it does increase, Asia will absorb much of it. China is transitioning from coal to gas. India is growing. Japan and Korea continue importing. Europe is just one buyer among many. Europe can't force LNG producers to sell to them at lower prices. It's a global market. The price is what buyers are willing to pay. Fourth, renewable energy can't replace gas for industrial needs. Solar and wind are intermittent. Chemical plants need 24/7 reliable power. You can't run a blast furnace on solar that only works during the day. Battery storage is too expensive for industrial scale. A chemical plant using constant gigawatts of power would need battery storage costing billions. Not economical. Nuclear would work. France generates 70% of electricity from nuclear and has much lower costs than Germany. But Germany shut down all nuclear plants in 2023. Other European countries are phasing out nuclear or not building new plants fast enough. So the renewable transition, which Europe is committed to for climate reasons, doesn't solve the industrial energy crisis. If anything, it makes it worse in the short to medium term. Fifth, subsidies are unsustainable fiscally. Some European governments subsidize industrial energy costs to keep companies from leaving. But this is expensive. Germany's energy subsidies cost tens of billions annually. France, Spain, Italy, all spending massively. These subsidies increase government debt. And the EU fiscal rules, the Maastricht criteria, limit deficits to 3% of GDP. Countries are already breaching these limits. Permanent energy subsidies would require either abandoning fiscal rules or finding cuts elsewhere. Neither is politically easy. So subsidies are temporary patches, not long-term solutions. Given these constraints, European governments have no policy option that solves the high energy cost problem. They're managing the decline, not reversing it. Now let's talk about who benefits from Europe's energy crisis, because in economics, one region's loss is another's gain. The United States is the biggest winner. Cheap natural gas from shale gives US industry a massive advantage. Chemical, steel, and manufacturing companies are investing in the US. BASF, a German company, is building plants in Louisiana. Ineos, British company, is expanding in Texas. Even Asian companies are building in the US because energy is cheap and the market is large. The Inflation Reduction Act added subsidies on top of cheap energy. So the US is getting industrial investment that would have gone to Europe. US LNG exports to Europe are also profitable. US companies buy gas domestically at $3, liquefy it, ship to Europe, and sell at $30. Minus transportation and liquefaction costs of about $10, that's $17 profit per unit. Enormous margins. US LNG export capacity has doubled since 2022. The US is now the world's largest LNG exporter, and Europe is the biggest customer. This is a structural shift that benefits US energy companies massively. China benefits strategically. European manufacturing relocating to China strengthens Chinese industrial capacity. BASF expanding in China means technology transfer, jobs, and industrial clustering. China also gets to position itself as a stable partner compared to Europe's energy chaos. For global companies choosing where to invest, China offers energy security through coal and nuclear, large domestic market, and established supply chains. Middle East benefits from LNG exports and attracting energy-intensive industries. Qatar is expanding LNG capacity specifically to serve Europe. Saudi Arabia and UAE are building petrochemical and aluminum industries using cheap local energy. These countries are moving up the value chain. Instead of just exporting oil and gas, they're using that energy to manufacture chemicals and metals and exporting the finished products. The losers are European workers in manufacturing, European governments that lose tax revenue and gain unemployed people, and European companies that can't compete on cost. Now let's talk about the climate dimension, because Europe's energy crisis is partly self-inflicted by climate policy. Europe committed to aggressive decarbonization. The European Green Deal aims for climate neutrality by 2050. This means phasing out fossil fuels, including natural gas. The logic was transition from coal and gas to renewables and nuclear, but the execution has been chaotic. Germany shut down nuclear without having enough renewable capacity to replace it. This created dependence on gas for baseload power. When Russian gas was cut off, Germany had to burn more coal to keep lights on, so emissions actually increased. The climate policy backfired in the short term. The broader problem is climate policy that increases energy costs without providing reliable alternatives, destroys industrial competitiveness. Companies leave for countries with cheaper energy, even if those countries have worse climate policies. BASF moving production to China, which gets 70% of electricity from coal, is worse for global emissions than operating in Germany. But it's economically rational for BASF. This is carbon leakage. Strict climate policy in Europe pushes emissions to other countries rather than reducing global emissions. Europe deindustrializes and loses jobs. Other countries industrialize and increase emissions. Net effect on climate is neutral or negative. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which taxes imports based on carbon content, tries to address this, but it's complex, faces legal challenges, and doesn't fully offset the cost disadvantage. The climate policy dilemma is real. Europe wants to lead on climate, but unilateral action that destroys competitiveness doesn't work unless other countries follow, and they're not following. The US is increasing fossil fuel production. China is building coal plants. India prioritizes growth over climate. So Europe is sacrificing economic strength for climate leadership that isn't achieving global emissions reductions. Some argue this is necessary moral leadership. Others argue it's economic self-destruction. The debate rages, but the outcome is clear. European industry is shrinking. Now let's talk about the social and political consequences, because economic decline doesn't happen in a vacuum. Manufacturing job losses are concentrated in industrial regions. Germany's Ruhr Valley, northern France, northern England. These are areas that depend on heavy industry. When factories close, entire communities are affected. Unemployment rises, tax revenue falls, local businesses suffer, young people leave for opportunities elsewhere. The regions decline. This creates political backlash. Voters in affected areas turn to populist parties that promise to bring back jobs and blame elites for the crisis. In Germany, Alternative for Germany is strongest in former industrial areas. In France, Marine Le Pen's National Rally dominates deindustrialized regions. In Italy, right-wing parties are rising. The political center is losing support because the establishment parties presided over deindustrialization. Voters want change, and populists promise radical solutions. Some of these solutions are economically nonsensical. Closing borders won't bring back industries that left because of high energy costs. Blaming immigrants doesn't solve the energy crisis. But the political appeal is real because people are suffering and want someone to blame and someone to promise solutions. Mainstream parties are struggling to respond. They can't reverse the energy crisis quickly. They can't subsidize industries forever. They can't abandon climate commitments. They're trapped between competing pressures. The result is political instability. Coalition governments collapsing, frequent elections, policy gridlock, all while the economic crisis deepens. Now let's talk about whether this is reversible, because some argue Europe can adapt and remain competitive despite high energy costs. The optimistic case is Europe shifts to high-value, less energy-intensive industries, software, services, advanced manufacturing that doesn't require massive energy inputs. Germany becomes more like Switzerland, high income, good quality of life, but not based on heavy industry. This requires successful economic transition. Workers in chemicals and steel retrain for tech and services. Regions adapt. New industries emerge to replace old ones. Historically, this kind of transition is possible but painful and slow. The US transitioned from manufacturing to services over 40 years. Britain transitioned from 1970s to 2000s. It's decades of adjustment with social costs. And it's not clear Europe can successfully make this transition because the energy crisis is accelerating deindustrialization faster than new industries can emerge. The pessimistic case is Europe enters long-term decline. Manufacturing leaves, services don't fully compensate, living standards stagnate or fall, young people emigrate. Europe becomes economically peripheral compared to the US and Asia. This is the British trajectory from the 1970s onward. Still wealthy by global standards, but no longer a dominant economic power. Europe collectively might follow this path. Reality is probably between these extremes. Europe remains wealthy. Quality of life is still high, but economic dynamism is lower. Growth is slower. Unemployment is higher, and global influence diminishes. For individuals, the implications are clear. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing. If you work in energy-intensive industry in Europe, the prospects are poor. Either your company relocates, or it downsizes, or it closes. The growth opportunities are in the US, China, and emerging markets, not Europe. So brain drain is a real risk. Young educated Europeans moving to where opportunities are better. For investors, European manufacturing companies with high energy exposure are risky. Chemical, steel, aluminum companies are either shrinking or relocating. Long-term investment returns will be poor. Energy companies, particularly LNG importers and renewable developers, might do well, but the industrial base they serve is shrinking. The broader investment thesis is that Europe is in structural decline relative to other regions, not collapse, but relative decline, and portfolios should reflect that. Now let's address the argument that Europe had no choice because supporting Russia through gas purchases was morally wrong. This is fundamentally a values question, not an economic one. Is it acceptable to buy energy from a country invading its neighbor? Different people will answer differently based on their values. The realpolitik argument is that countries act in their economic interests. China, India, Turkey, all continued buying Russian energy despite the war. They prioritized their economies over solidarity with Ukraine. Europe chose differently. They prioritized values over economics. The cost is deindustrialization and economic decline. But the moral position is they're not funding aggression. Whether this was the right choice depends on your values framework. If you believe economic prosperity should always take precedence, then cutting off Russian gas was a mistake. If you believe standing against aggression justifies economic costs, then it was the right choice. History will judge, but the economic consequences are clear regardless of the moral assessment. The counterfactual is what would have happened if Europe had continued buying Russian gas. Probably Russia would have more resources to fund the war, but European industry would be competitive. Ukraine would still be at war, but European workers would have jobs. It's an impossible trade-off, and different countries made different choices. Germany initially tried to maintain some Russian gas, faced political pressure and stopped completely. Hungary continues buying Russian gas despite criticism, chooses economic interest over solidarity. There's no universally correct answer, but the consequences of Europe's choice are playing out, and they're severe economically. If this breakdown of why Europe pays 10 times more for gas than the US, why LNG is structurally more expensive than pipelines, which industries are leaving and where they're going, and why this crisis is permanent without policy changes, Europe won't make changed how you see European competitiveness and the energy transition, hit that like button and subscribe. We're tracking every factory closure, every company relocating, every sign that Europe's industrial base is shrinking. Leave a comment. Can Europe survive with energy costs 10 times higher than competitors? Should Europe have kept Russian gas despite Ukraine? Which country benefits most from European industrial exodus? Share this with anyone in manufacturing, energy, or anyone who thinks Europe's economy is stable. After this, they'll understand why energy costs are deindustrializing Europe in real time and why there's no easy solution.